it is now time to get this started, and Beau's already sharing out his slides. Welcome to our next webcast, everybody. Greatly appreciate it. I have Mike and Beau on. They're going to be talking about RDP logging bypass and Azure Active Directory Recon, which is an area near and dear to our heart. You've heard me talk a lot about cloud-based research. There's a lot of people in security and pen testing, and this is great. They're spending a lot of time talking about endpoint security bypass. They're talking about how can we use Active Directory against itself. But the fact of the matter is we're quickly getting to the point where Active Directory is seen less and less and less, especially in some newer organizations. So we need to kind of branch out. And this is the first of the webcasts that we'll start talking about some of these things that have predominantly been researched by Beau and Mike at Black Hills Information Security. And with that, I will serve as a channel for any questions that'll be coming up on the webcast and typing furiously to answer as many of those questions as possible. We also have CJ, our COO, is also answering as many questions as he can furiously. And then as we get to questions that I can't answer, which will be many, I will bring it up to both Beau and Mike. But with that, I'll hand it over to you, gentlemen, and I'll get to the questions.
Hey there, everyone. Thanks for coming to the webcast today. As John said, we're going to be talking about a couple things, and these two things are actually from some research that we did leading up to our Wild West Hackin' Fest talk this last year. This last talk, we had a few ideas initially going into that talk, and we ended up putting this like kind of mystery box of like Microsoft service, not necessarily exploits, but like different techniques for kind of getting around some of the traditional stuff that we see on pen tests. And we ended up throwing together 4 different things, and we kind of, I don't know, squished that all into one presentation and didn't really do, I would say, like the best job of describing as thoroughly as we probably could some of the items.
We didn't have a lot of dialogue either. I think we kind of just, we had so much content, we just rushed through as much as we could.
Well, and I think there was a couple of people that their hair was like pushed back. It was basically 4 keynotes and 1 presentation.
So definitely, like, this is a great opportunity to ask questions. I think we're gonna definitely have more dialogue in this one to kind of flesh out some of these ideas. So the first one that I think, well, I guess let me introduce us first, right? So you have myself, Beau Bullock, red teamer, pen tester at Black Hills, and Mike Felch.
Same thing, and pretty much the same thing.
Hosts of some shows, Tradecraft Security Weekly, CoinSec Podcast. And we, Mike doesn't have avid OA enthusiast under his, but he is. He's definitely.
I had something for Google, but then I pulled it out, and so I didn't know what to put because, like, I don't know. I did a lot of research on the Google side of the house, and so you were on the Microsoft, and so I was going to be like, oh, that'd be cool to put there, and then I couldn't find anything cool to put, so I just pulled it out.
And speaking of Google, you're going to be doing like some sort of webcast sometime soon about completely evicting yourself from Google, right?
Yeah, I purged it's a whole other ballgame. Yeah, we'll be a blog post. We should turn it into more of like something interactive, because I think there's a lot of dialogue that people. I have a lot of questions. I get questions all the time. But real quick, I purged Google out of my life and out of my house, and it was a lot of effort, a lot of work. So that'll be probably something coming up. But it's such a undertaking if you're ever trying to do that, especially for somebody that's been wrapped in Google for their entire career.
Well, so. I think that's going to be a blog post, right? And I think that would be a good webcast too. And I really do think we should talk about like the creepy line. We should talk about like what is the quote that always comes up: if you're not paying for it, you're the product, you're what's being sold. And I think that we need to discuss that too. But that'll definitely be a webcast coming up, and Breeze probably trying to panic and say, oh yeah, that's it, 2019, we've got all the webcasts, no more, unless you want to do 2 a week. And I don't know if anybody wants that, but yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So, and fun fact, that picture's a picture of us that we snuck into a security closet as Cisco employees. So yeah, just, we do physicals too sometimes. Have fun. All right. So what we're covering today, like we've already said, RDP logging bypass and Azure AD Recon. We're going to dive into each one of these pretty thoroughly in this webcast, I would say. For the first one, I'm going to be kind of leading up to the whole RDP logging bypass. So when I say logging bypass, we're talking about authentication failures, bypassing those logs and the actual event logs. And then for the Azure AD Recon, Mike will be kind of chiming in on some really cool stealthy enumeration of AD.
Yeah.
Okay, so This one was like the title would suggest, curious to begin with, and has become something that I feel like it's something that I want to show as many customers as I possibly can now. Like it's gotten to the point where I've gotten on assessments now, and I'm like, you really need to see this, because this is something that I think is kind of eye-opening, and it's not patchable per se. It's something that you would have to do a great deal of effort to try to coordinate and figure out how this is actually happening and how to like alert on it. So I'm going to try to walk through this and try to step up into the point where we kind of like discover this. So it's going to start out kind of like very low level, talking about password spraying in general, and then kind of work our way into this how to change up the logs. So credentials 101. Let's talk about like what are credentials and why does an attacker need a credential? Well, first, access leads to more access. We on pen tests and red teams, the first thing we're trying to do is get your users' credentials at this point. I can't remember the last time that I've used an actual like exploit per se. Like Mike, I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a lot of stuff's patched nowadays. I mean, at least some of the engagements that we're on, and usually I think I say creds are king. That's like a little thing I always say. Everybody hears me say. But I'm completely agree with you. I mean, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm looking for creds.
And there's a number of ways we can do that too. I mean, but like once we get credentials, like it could be really useful in the end game of what we're trying to achieve, or it could be something that's not really that useful. And what I mean by that is that there are different values for different types of sites that we get access to. So for example, let's say that we found an external web portal that your users use. That might be connected to Active Directory, or it might not be. But let's say that we assume that it is something that is connected to Active Directory, and we phish one of your users, and using like Mike's tool, Cred Sniper, which Mike, I don't know if you want to talk about Cred Sniper for a minute, like quick overview of what that is.
Yeah, for sure. So like you're targeting an organization, right? And a lot of times it's either going to be a Microsoft or a Google environment. I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's one of those two. And you're external to the network, and everybody wants to go internal and pop shells and do all the cool stuff that we've seen in videos forever. But the reality is, if you can get and obtain a set of credentials for an account for an employee at an organization, then you're good. So Cred Sniper was birthed out of this need for not only getting credentials, but also bypassing two-factor. So we were on a red team and needed to, so I got creds the first time. I phished them, I spear phished one of their people, and went to log in, and I got hit with two-factor, and I was like, no. And so real quickly, I logged in with the credentials and then created a fake two-factor page in order to ask the user for the two-factor. And so that's basically how Cred Sniper was done. But the idea behind it is you can phish for credentials and phish for the two-factor token. And behind the scenes, Cred Sniper will log into the account to trigger the two-factor message to get sent to the phone. And that's basically what it is.
And with that, with regards to like what we could get to after we get those credentials, so we've been dealing more and more with customers who are moving into the cloud. Like that's, I think, one of our methodology changes, the big methodology changes over the last year and a half, has been that we've been really targeting the cloud services that our customers are using, because that's typically where all the data is at this point, which is kind of crazy to say. Like it used to be, I think historically most customers had this kind of like castle-like structure where they have like the firewall that's like the outside wall and all the data is inside. Well, now, as organizations are getting larger, as it's, your workforce is being more remote in nature, we're finding that a lot of organizations are moving all of their infrastructure into cloud-based. We'll talk about Azure here in a little bit, but I mean, you can put an entire organization in the cloud at this point. You don't even need like on-prem servers.
So a couple of quick questions that just popped up. Does Cred Sniper work against O365?
Yeah, so it's modular based, so it'll actually work against any application website that's out there. The idea is that I pushed out a bunch of functionality specifically for Google and G Suite. I do believe there may be an O365 module where there's a pull request. I don't know if I ever merged it. It might be there. I forget which ones I've merged already. And then there's a lot of them that we have internally that we use, but I don't ever push those modules just because, I mean, they're usually for a customer that's like a tech company or something, and so I don't want to just give the baby out. But you can create them for anything. You could create one for O365, a custom O365 portal, pretty much anything.
Cool. And then another question, Cred Sniper, does it work with the likes of Duo?
Yeah, so so what Cred Sniper does is it's authenticating to the actual web portal, right? So whatever login mechanism that's there for that user. And so typically what tends to happen is when you authenticate, that authentication portal will use whatever is configured, whether it's Duo, whether it's Google Authenticator, and then it'll log in. So as long as you're hitting those right routes for the authentication, like the post with the user credentials, and you script that in the module, then it'll work with pretty much any two-factor. It'll even work with the UTF devices, the hardware tokens, although it doesn't work with the G Suite because they've actually implemented it right. But let's just say that used, I don't know, password manager, and the password manager used the two-factor hardware token. They don't really verify properly. It's a bad, poor implemented UTF implementation, so it'll work against even those.
So yeah, I mean, once we get access to Creds at this point, I mean, we find so much more data in things like file shares and on the cloud, like so SharePoint, other various like sites like your like in terms of O365, we have Outlook, right? So we can read emails. So this is typically the first step for most attackers at this point, and it's definitely one of the first steps for us. So let's talk about password policies real quick. So the default for most environments is 8 characters. So when it comes to us trying to obtain passwords through methods like password spraying, which we're going to talk about, it's not that difficult because we find that the default password policy allows users to select really poor passwords. Things like Fall 2018, which fits the default password policy for most Windows environments. Okay, so let's talk about a few different ways to get credentials. First off, most people already understand the concept of brute forcing a password. So that would be us trying, like, let's say a word list of thousands of passwords against one account, in the hopes that one of those passwords is that user's password. Now, there's definitely some web applications out there. There's a lot of different services that will allow you to just submit as many passwords as you want and not lock anybody out. But when we start talking about Active Directory logins, you're going to get locked out really quickly in most environments if there's a lockout policy in place, which by default is usually around like the 5-character mark. Then there's another idea. What about password reuse? So over the last few years, we've collected a number of various breach dumps that have occurred. Mike, I mean, I know you have a number of files containing like a ton of creds.
1.8 billion.
Yeah. So there you go, 1.8 billion creds. And those are real creds that have been dumped from various sources throughout the years. Like, for example, like the big LinkedIn breach that happened. Like those creds just get dumped to the internet for the most part, and we add them to the database of sorts. And what we find is that a lot of users typically reuse their passwords. And so if we can just go look at what they used on LinkedIn and then go try it on their corporate account, then we have a password reuse problem there and might have valid cred.
We usually see this a lot. Real quick, let me just chime in on this. I like this password reuse one. It seems like it's something that you would expect, right? But a lot of times you don't realize how it surfaces. So what I'll do is I have a database of all of the credentials in their cracked form, right? So usually the password hashes get leaked and then we crack them, or somebody else cracks them and then they get put together. But so this database, I will go to and search for a customer's domain and then export all of the credentials from the database. And then what I do is I'll move it into a spreadsheet, and then I'll put a number representing how many times that password is in that list, and then I'll sort it. And what surfaces is a company's support help desk will reset their password to like welcome one, and you'll see welcome one a number of different times. And what tends to happen is these employees are taking that welcome one password and using them on third-party sites because it's just something that's familiar to them. So it's weird how it shows up.
Yep. And then we already talked about credential phishing using something like Mike's Cred Sniper, which is really, really great at doing that job. And then we're going to talk about password spraying, which this particular portion of the talk is kind of like. I like this picture. This is a picture of a bunch of locks. And I like it because I think it kind of accurately kind of displays the picture of an Active Directory environment where you have users that have all these different locks, which could symbolize like their accounts, right? Now, there are such things as key-to-like locks. And what that means is that you can use the same key for multiple locks. Now, if a user has multiple, or if an environment has multiple locks that are key-to-like, that means somebody used the same key. And that's kind of what we're getting at with regards to this password spraying issue, is in that if I can figure out a way to sort of build a key that is common, like something that might be easy. So like, let's say that I could, build the pinning out of the key to like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which might be like a very basic way to look at it. I might be able to open a lot of these locks. So that's kind of like the very basic look at it. Now, what I'm trying to get at there is that we're not going to try using 1,000 keys against one of those locks. We're going to try using one key against thousands of locks. And that's what password spraying essentially is that we're going to try the same password against every account in your environment. And we could use something like Winter2018 at this point. And what we'll find is that a lot of your users likely have chosen something like that password because it does fit that policy. And while that'll generate thousands of failed logins, it won't actually lock any of those accounts out. And I mean, Mike, like we do this all the time, like every assessment. I'm pretty sure we've talked about it on every webcast. It's super successful, like highly successful. This is like what we do now.
Yep. I mean, the only time it's not really successful is when they have a good password policy.
Yep.
When the password policy is decent.
Rare.
Rare.
It is pretty rare. Yep.
What was it? The season and year has been replaced. We see season and year all the time. So like Winter 2019 is going to come up very heavily. And then some organizations got smart, so they banned that password. And they're like, oh, you can't use season and year. And I think it was one of the recent tests somebody tried on the team, like season year with pound at the end. And they're like, oh, we just got 20 more. So it was just like a very small change in their password.
Yep. Yeah, I don't understand why like something like Winter 2018 could be banned, but Winter 2018 pound wouldn't be, because you would think like containing the word winter would be banned.
Well, they're not looking at the plain text either. They're looking at the hash of it, right? So they're comparing hashes they're taking the hash of the password for that user, and then they're taking a word list and then generating a hash and then comparing the hashes with stored.
Yep, and that only really works with like landman, NT type environments or straight MD5 hashes.
We actually had a customer recently that had an internal, it was like a web app of sorts that was for changing their passwords. It was their like internal, this is the site you use to change your password. And they actually did implement a password blacklist through that, which actually did like kind of what I was saying. It would look at what you're trying to set first, I think, and then prevent you from selecting that word from the word list.
Yeah, we have Cred Defense that does that too. Mm-hmm. It even installs you can install it, and it password audits, does all kinds of cool stuff.
Well, and it also does the Cred Defense toolkit does the actual words, but also variations of that word, or if that word is being used. We had one group that got a hold of me. They actually took an entire dictionary and they fed it through, and it wouldn't accept any passwords at all. You have to be really, really careful.
Typical AD password spraying, I've got a few different methods that we'd like to use. So if we have access to an internal system that has the ability to communicate with a domain with like a domain user's credential, we can use a tool that I wrote called Domain Password Spray, which is a PowerShell tool. It will go grab all the users from the domain and then try whatever password you want against all of this. Another method that I've used pretty often is just using Metasploit's SMB login module. Just feed it a user list and whatever password you want and point it at a DC and let it go. Or actually, any system for that matter. It'll tell you if the credential is valid because it will still authenticate to whatever domain it is if there is a system on the domain that you're pointing it at. So again, so this technique will generate a lot of failed login events, and it's very easy to track this down. For the most part, you're going to be getting the source IP address for the user account that is generating these failed logins. So, we've had multiple customers that have alerted on this at this point. And so we started kind of thinking of some new ways to try to evade that logging and the detection. So one of the first things that we started looking at is well, like what are the setups they're using, first of all, like in terms of how are they alerting on it? Are they using, Splunk engines? What is it they're pulling together? So we started doing this technique where we were performing these failed logins against OA, and this is something that we'd done on externals all the time. And traditionally you have like an OA server that's externally facing, and for the majority of the tests that we do, like I'm doing these failed logins externally, and I never really cared so much for the attribution because, in terms of like VPSs, like I could spin up like a virtual private server and, have a different IP from there or proxy it. There's a lot of ways to kind of evade externally, but what we wanted to look at is internally. How do we not get caught internally? So I started doing this on internal assessments, and it turns out that like the actual logs that get generated from failed logins against OA are not in your same Windows Event Security log on that server. You have like, I guess, IIS logs next to it, which have those. And so, for example, I had a customer I was just working on a couple weeks ago that I was doing this particular type of password spraying against their OA server, and they were seeing that the failed login events were occurring, but there was no source IP. There was no attribution of where it was actually coming from. So that is one method potentially, but like I said, there are IIS logs that you could coordinate where that IP was coming from. So where else could we try authenticating from? Mike, do you have something?
So yeah, I actually, it's kind of answering that question as well, but still externally, like link servers, right? So I know we've been doing link a lot lately as well. Have you noticed? I don't know if you've noticed anything, but between OA and link, like OA detecting OA but missing link, isn't that, or does it originate from the same location?
So I'm not sure, but it depends on what type of authentication is happening, right? So like I know with EWS, Exchange Web Services, that I believe that is an actual NTLM authentication to the server itself and not necessarily something that would show up in the IIS log, while OA is actually like an IIS service, I believe.
Okay, because I had a customer that was detecting OA but not detecting link, and I thought that was weird because I figured they would both be communicating with EWS or something.
So one of the problems that I've kind of looked into talking with some of our customers is you have like Microsoft Azure Security Center, and that incorporates a lot of really cool user behavioral and entity analytics. And then you have Office 365, which has its completely different, I think it's like OA Cloud Security or something like that. And that actually implements the user behavioral and entity analytics. And that's one of the problems that we're seeing with a number of vendors is they will have the ability to detect password sprays, but it'll be for a small subset of all of your different properties that you're running, whether you're running like Amazon AWS or you're running Azure and OA, and trying to tie those together is something that's just not happening as much as it should right now.
Cool. So we started looking like where else can we maybe try this? Like what we were like, I was on a purple team and we were trying to figure out like how can we perform a password spray that they would not detect. And so we started looking at RDP, and this is kind of what this whole thing is about. This whole part of this this webcast, anyway. Now that we finally got to it. So what I did is I tested out this tool called X-Free RDP, which is a Linux-based RDP client against a Windows server that the customer had. And to our surprise, like the failed login event on the server didn't actually contain the source IP address. The host name was in the log. And so like I was like, oh, okay, well that's not good. But then I started looking at some of the options for X-Free RDP, and it shows that there is actually like an option to set the client host name, which I was like, what? Like, wait, so I can tell the client what to tell the server?
To my interests.
Yeah, like so there's no IP, and I can tell the client the host name I want it to tell the server. That's odd. So we set out to write this like password spraying tool with RDP with X-Free RDP first off. And in doing some research, we found that it's actually NLA that's the culprit as to why there's no IP. So network layer authentication. So when you go to RDP to a server and you have like the like pre like authentication box that pops up prior to you actually getting to the GUI, that's like the Windows login. So that's NLA pre-authenticating you before you actually get to the Windows like server like graphic user interface. So when that happens, it's allegedly supposed to be like more secure because you're not getting to like the GUI before logging in, but there's no IP address that gets logged at that point. So I'll get to the point where I'm talking about like updated servers having this, but at this point, like Windows 2012 and back does not have the source IP. So I started digging into this, and I was wondering, well, this has got to be something that is well known. I mean, like there's no way that I just found like some thing that's this. I mean, that seems like a huge issue to me. And so I started just Googling around, and I found some people talking about how that there's supposed to be another log that NLA should log to in the applications and services log, and it should be this operational event ID 140. So I started looking at that, and so what we found is that an event where you submit a failed login using a username that is not a member of that domain will in fact generate that log. So it will tell you a connection from this client computer with IP address of whatever the attacker's system failed because the username or password not correct. But oddly enough, that log does not get generated if you use a valid username. So if we go get a list of valid users from the domain and use that while we're password spraying, this log never gets generated. So
even with an invalid password.
Even with an invalid password, yeah. So that's a bit concerning. So
that just means you have to strategically spray, right? We're not just throwing random usernames. We're actually pulling the users for the domain.
So I had someone ask a question, which is weird. Okay, I'm getting a lot of WTFs going on right now.
Okay.
So somebody just said, what do you think about password spraying by asking the Kerberos KDC for creating TGTs directly? TGT is good password, no TGT equals bad password. Should be much stealthier.
I believe Mick Douglas sent us a password spraying script. That,
let me check. That's Better Safety Net.
I believe he just sent us one that does that. In fact, I have not looked at it in depth, but I believe that's what it does.
I think it does exactly that. Here we go. I will share that tweet out with everybody. Thank you.
All right. So here's a quick demo. So we've got our attacking system here. It's a Kali box with IP address of 192.168.88.245. And I'm going to show you like basically our desktop first, because our desktop doesn't actually have like the NLA ability built into it. You'd have to set up Kerberos and stuff on the Kali box to get our desktop to do that. So it doesn't actually RDP using NLA. It just uses the traditional. I think it uses TLS to do this RDP. So we're going to generate a failed login event with our dvader user on the domain. And let's go take a look at the log. So if we go and refresh, and there's our audit failure. So this is the traditional log you would expect. You have the username, you have unknown username or bad password. This is what you would traditionally correlate and be like, oh yeah, that attacker is coming from this IP address. Let's go shut them down, whatever, right? So what I wanted to do, and we mentioned this earlier, the fact that the host name or the X3RDP has an option for the client host name. I couldn't get it to work, but I found a kind of a workaround for that, and I generated this super janky proof of concept script that I absolutely want to make better, but it definitely demonstrates the point. So what you see here is a list of host names that I kind of just threw in a file, just printer one, not an attacker. So these are going to be the list of host names that we send to the server that actually do get logged.
It would be really cool. Yeah, it would be really cool to pull the servers on the domain and pull those usernames and then put those in the list. That way you're spraying and it looks like it's coming from a specific server, and now your incident response teams are running to that server and they're doing their digital forensics on it and trying to figure out what's going on. And
even better, make it look like it's coming from like a security admin system spraying network.
Shut down the SOC.
Bobby, what are you doing?
Our pen test got the lead security analyst fired.
So, and then here's our list of domain users that we're going to be actually spraying against. So this is something we would have attained from the domain already. So list of valid users, so we don't generate that other log. And then I have this, like I said, this proof of concept script, which I'll show a link to that at the end of this. And we're going to use a password of spring 2017 because that's my little test domain. I've had it built since then, so that's the password that was valid at this point. And so what you'll see here is the cred was probably valid, but the user's not allowed to RDP. And what that means is that, so this was a DC in my little test environment. And what I was doing is essentially just showing that the credentials user is valid on the domain, but they're low-level users. They're not, they're not DAs. They're not going to be able to actually RDP against that DC. So the script will tell you that.
Jim just pointed out, he goes, this is going to create a lot of chaos. Yes.
So let's go refresh the logs and take a look at some of these audit failures at this point. So if we start scrolling down, we see workstation name share 5 with no source IP. Let's take another one. Workstation name share 1 with no source IP. So I mean, you get the point, right? I mean, it's we're telling your logs the host name. Don't look here, with no IP in the log, and this is RDP with NLA's fault. So let's go look at the other log that's supposed to have the event ID 140. If we take a look at that log, we'll see that there's no event ID 140s in our logs either. There are logs that will say that the server accepted a TCP connection from an IP address. And so this gets to the point where we talk about correlating these logs. So the fix for this is correlating a informational level log with an informational level log from that applications and services log with the failed login log that doesn't actually show you a host name or IP, which becomes like a time battle at that point. Like you have to be fast, right? Like you'd have to actually, you'd have to like correlate it quickly, right? Like you'd have to see like, boom, failed login, boom, source IP from this other log. So that's kind of like what the recommendation is there. Any questions so far?
So Robert said application and services, Windows NTLM logs will capture the information IP address of the failed login.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying is with the application services log, you'll get that source IP, but it doesn't actually correlate it to a failed event log. That's what I was trying to say.
Oh, okay.
Like it doesn't actually tell you there's a failed event log. You'll see a connection. So I mean, if you're spraying a DC, you probably have connections from other places as well.
Yep. And a lot of people are asking about the defenses for this, and everybody, that's coming up. Just sit tight.
Yeah.
people are panicking, and that's okay.
The pen tester side of us, the attacker side, I want to build it better. I want to make it something I can just do in Windows. But for now, that's the proof of concept. So like this is what I was going to tell you is with Windows Server 2016, they did fix that. Okay, so upgrade to 2016. That's the fix. that's the true fix. It does log the source IP. If you can't, you have to correlate those other logs. So you have to be able to look at the failed event log that happens that you don't have any attribution, you don't have the IP address, you don't have the host name, the valid host name, and you have to be able to correlate that with that applications and services log. This blog post here has a great example of how to do that. So if there's any screenshot to take, this would be the one to do. We'll have these slides up later too, right, John?
Yes, all the slides and this will be archived and shared out.
Cool. And then again, like it might be worth taking a look at just firewall logs for the meantime too, which I mean, I know that can be a pain in the ass, but yeah. Alrighty, Azure AD Recon, Mr. Felch.
Yeah, fun stuff. Okay, cool. So you're controlling. So
Yes.
This idea is, so once we get Creds, we've been talking about Creds a lot, but the idea was on a red team, you're external to the internal network. And usually the companies that we're testing are pretty decent companies, I would say. I mean, we've had obviously our handful of ones that were just, were horrid, but the majority of the ones I think, at least that I've seen from the red team perspective, seem to be pretty well secured with your traditional controls. They usually have a good internal team or SOC, and so your traditional. Let me just throw some macro-ridden doc at some employee to see if I can pop a shell. Days are kind of over, or at least coming to a halt. they haven't been very successful. And so instead of going the traditional route, I tend to look at an organization and say, let me do a really decent threat model of what I'm looking at, what infrastructure we found during the recon, what are they using for mail gateway? That'll give us a good indicator if they're a Microsoft company or a G Suite company. And then target the organization the way that you would expect a adversary to target the organization, not just throw stuff at the wall, although there are those that are happening as well. And I think, you know, you could still get the Prince send me $1 million emails every once in a while. But the likelihood of that being successful in the environments that we've been testing has went down. And so because of that, as a result, it's forced our hand to kind of look in areas where we haven't looked before or that haven't been discussed very much publicly. I mean, we love reusing other people's research and building on it and trying to make things better, but sometimes you don't have that ability. And that's kind of what we came with regard to this. So, you know, Beau and I have been working on the G Suite for a while now and kind of leveraging the different features of G Suite. And so I wanted to kind of do the same thing, but looking at from Microsoft's perspective, and then start kind of researching from there. And so that kind of led me down this rabbit hole of I have credentials for this employee. I'm reading their email. Super nice lady as well. Felt really bad, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to really I didn't know what to do. I'm kind of in this jam where I'm not really able to pivot anywhere. I'm still external. I don't want to try to pop any shells because I think that's just really loud and kind of reckless, especially if they're a cloud-based organization. And so I started kind of just looking around at what options Microsoft had for O365. And if you've ever looked at the product suite from Microsoft for their cloud-based servers, don't do it. It is a nightmare. I mean, they have so much stuff. I mean, they have Exchange Online, I mean, Office 365, and then they have, I mean, it's a mess. You have so many different authentication mechanisms that they've kind of grown over the years that we'll get into. And so that kind of birthed out this idea that I found with regard to Active Directory, but within Azure. And so that's kind of where we start with this. That's kind of the backstory, if you want to go ahead. And so, so external Active Directory is really interesting. And so the concept is, once again, low privilege credentials are gold. Creds are king. And if you've ever been on an internal engagement as an offensive security person, or even as somebody that manages an Active Directory domain on the internal network, you might be familiar with ADExplorer. Really cool tool. But so this is pretty much just as good, if not probably better in some cases. The other cool thing with external Active Directory is you using low privileged users. I could log in, I could pivot over to Azure, and we're gonna get into the details of it, but I can create guest users. So imagine the same thing happening on the internal network, where you were able to like let's just say that you were sitting on the internal network and you were able to create a credential in Active Directory as a regular user, as a low-level user. That sounds unheard of. Yet we have that ability kind of within external Active Directory within Azure AD. And the other beauty behind this is you can target the organization much more quickly. I mean, if you're on the internal network, there's awesome tools for that, like Bloodhound, and it'll give you like who are all the groups, all their sessions, and all of where they're logged in, and the whole 9 yards. But on the external network, when you're not even in the organization yet, targeting an organization traditionally has always been, let me just go to LinkedIn to see what employees are on the software development team, and then try to profile it using open source intelligence. This gives us the ability to kind of profile and target the organization much more quickly, because now we could start seeing things and tearing apart Active Directory groups and kind of looking at it. And then the other thing is you could usually completely go under the radar. Like on the internal network, I mean, they're logging for net user /domain, so you're going to be able to be loud, or there's ADFS and all these other ADSI, where a lot of the internal commands are on the endpoint are being detected, or the network communication over the directory, Active Directory environment is detected. But when you're external to the organization and you're looking at a portal that's in Azure that they might not be aware of, a lot of that can go under the radar. And so that's another thing that I really like about this. And so because of that, this is all externally, and I thought it was a pretty big deal whenever I started kind of coming across it. So yeah. And so before we get into kind of the details, how does this work? And so if you're familiar with Microsoft environments over the years, you might be familiar with like DirSync, and that's for synchronizing Active Directories kind of across the on-prem systems. And then they moved to kind of like this Azure AD Sync, which was kind of like directory sync, but for Azure, including Azure and on-prem. And then they had like Forefront Identity Manager. And so taking all of the traditional stuff that they've done, and they changed the name, a gazillion times, they have Azure AD Connect. And the concept's pretty simple. You have an engine that's kind of running on-prem on the Active Directory, in the Active Directory environment, and then you have the syncing service, which is running in Azure. And so basically, whenever you have applications that want to authenticate to Active Directory, they're going to come and they're external to the environment. They could use some sort of federation or these different synchronizations to do the authentication with Azure. And those still single sign-on accounts can be validated against the internal on-prem Active Directory if you're still running that kind of hybrid model. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can run all Azure Active Directory. And so it really supports a number of different authentication and endpoints where you can kind of communicate with an Active Directory environment. It's kind of the nuts and bolts of the authentication. If you want to go to the next slide. And so this happens in a kind of a cool way. The first thing that happens is there's a traditional MD4 hash on the on-prem server within Active Directory. They generate a SHA-256 hash. Of that hash, that's obviously to avoid the historical pass-the-hash problems that they've had within on-prem environments. The domain controller is going to add a salt to that, and it's going to send the salt and the hash of the hash to Azure. It's going to use some sort of envelope, and then Azure is going to get it, and it's going to decrypt it and store that password hash in Azure. And so then what happens is as you authenticate against Azure Active Directory, it's going to hash your password, and it's going to compare that hash with the stored hash to determine whether or not it's the right password. And so that's kind of how it happens, and it happens on an interval. I think you could fine tune a lot of this stuff, but it's a fairly good model, I guess, for being able to cache user passwords in that environment. Now, depending on the synchronization configuration, which is can get really complex, Azure could actually synchronize back with Active Directory. So you could update Active Directory objects from Azure and synchronize back to Active Directory. And so that kind of happens with that same session and the yards. But that's basically how the password gets hashed and whatnot. And so you want to go to the next slide, we'll talk about a little bit more on what's actually happening. And so what does this mean? Globally, this is what it means. We have the ability now to identify all the users of an organization, all of the forest, all of the domains that are there. We can read the Active Directory properties that you would normally see kind of on that Active Directory object within the on-prem environment. If you know what that means as a red team or as a pen tester, sometimes, actually a lot of times, you can find notes on Active Directory objects that have like passwords, plain text in there, because the support team says, hey, I updated this password to support 2018. Sally from Black Hills actually is the one that put me on that. I didn't even know about it, and she showed me in the Active Directory Explorer that plain text passwords are on these objects.
I just had the same exact thing happen on a pen test like last week, and there was a ton of creds, just clear text attached to AD attributes. So go search your Active Directory environment for where your system admins have just blatantly added credentials attached to user objects.
Yeah. So the other cool thing is you can look at groups, right? So now Active Directory security groups. So now I know who the developers are. I don't have to go to LinkedIn. I know who the backend engineers are, who the DevOps team are. I know who the security team, who to watch out for. And you can really profile an organization just by looking at the groups, the users, and the memberships. The other thing that Azure opens up to an attacker is the attack surfaces. A lot of times these single sign-on applications that you might not have been aware of are tied in authorized apps for Azure, which means now you've just expanded the attack surface. And this matters to me on an external or on a red team where I'm external, because while a lot of times we might not know those critical servers on the internal infrastructure, if they're a cloud-based organization and they're running like Salesforce and they're running AWS and they're running their infrastructure in these cloud environments, knowing which ones have single sign-on permission is super critical in order to be able to figure out where I'm pivoting, because you could literally compromise an entire organization externally without ever hitting the internal network. And so the other thing that it opened up to that I noticed was devices. So not only do you know the users of an Active Directory environment in an organization, but now you could also see the last time that they authenticated was using this version of Windows or this mobile device. So now you know, oh, well, they're running Android, which means they're probably running Google services, which means if I authenticate to their Google account and jump over to play.google.com, I could push an app to their phone and push my malware or whatever. And so there's all kinds of pivotable surfaces that arise whenever you're looking at the application portion of Active Directory. And then obviously the directory itself, right? So sometimes there's domains or there's partners that they're associating with that you can learn and pivot over to. And then obviously the memberships. So I kind of talked on that before, but it's good to know users, groups, and memberships. Plus there's a lot more stuff that's kind of in there. I mean, if you're looking at if you're doing like what I do, I'll target the most technical at an organization. It sounds crazy. A lot of people, I bring it up a lot, but a lot of people are intimidated to target an organization's security team or technical team because they're going to be so on par. But what they're failing to realize is that just because they have a specific role doesn't mean that their character traits of that personality aren't more inclined to help a user, for instance, because they're very outgoing people. And if you are targeting an employee that's like that, they're more likely to help you despite them being a very technical person. And so the psychological side of targeting comes into play, where now I could say, I know the DevOps team, or I know this because I want an engineer, because the engineer is going to have the most access, especially if they've been there for a long time. I mean, if they're an engineer that's been at a large organization for 5 years, they probably have a super lax workflow. They've probably been there for a long time, real comfortable, and so just it makes it surface a little bit easier. So that's kind of all the cool stuff that this means for playing around in the Active Directory environment. So go to the next one. So we'll talk about now ADExplorer just briefly. I know I touched on it a little bit before, but it's really cool. I'm going to show you the parallel between being internal and looking at Active Directory and being external and being able to look at Active Directory. So on an internal environment, using ADExplorer is basically just an Active Directory browser. You could view, you could edit objects, you could kind of look through with all kinds of weird searches. So if you wanted to search on like certain object attributes of that Active Directory object, then you could kind of do that and filter down. And so this tool really gives you that ability to drive home really good browsing of Active Directory in a quick snapshot. The other thing that you could do is, Sally showed me this as well. This is like, she loves this tool. You can create offline snapshots of Active Directory and then just pull it offline so you're not constantly creating that network connection. And that's, I don't know how loud it is. I haven't seen anybody communicate back from the teams that we've tested on how loud it is. I don't know if you've seen anything, Beau. Yeah, so I don't know how loud it is, but I usually just pull it offline, and then because it is pretty slow, especially with an environment with 30,000 employees. And then you could browse forests, and it's just a nice little GUI. So that's basically ADExplorer on the internal. So the next slide, real quick, will show you kind of the parallel between Azure Active Directory and ADExplorer. So you have all of the same properties that you could view on the users and you could read. You can look at the security groups. You don't get the attack surfaces that you would get on an internal network, which is kind of interesting. And you can still see the device info. I think you can do that with ADExplorer in a weird way. You might not get the actual patch level or the version of operating system that they're running, like down to like the specifics. But you'd still be able to see like what computers are on the network. So I left that in there. You can still see the domains that are a part of that forest. You can look at memberships. You can't add a guest user or an MFA device. And I bring up MFA device because we had a customer where we added a guest account. They had two-factor, so we had credentials and two-factor token. I added a guest user, and then I just added my own guest MFA device in order to be able to authenticate, which was kind of bypassing the whole purpose of having two-factor. And then obviously with internal, you can create a snapshot. You can't really do that with Azure AD as a snapshot, but I'm going to show you how you can get the data out still. And you could both, in both environments, edit the objects, which is, I think, super relative and really useful. And so now Active Directory, so there's no nerd left behind with this. This is really cool. So you get the portal if you just want like a super GUI, or if you're super lazy and you don't want to have to go, pip install or apt-get install or, PowerShell install. So you could just use your browser and go to azure.portal.com after you authenticate with the user's credentials, and that'll drop you straight into the Azure portal, and then you can click on Active Directory, which I'll show you in a second. Or if you're a Linux neckbeard and you wanted to use like a command line tool, they have it for you. So if you're familiar with like AWS command line tool, there's one called AZ CLI, and it's really useful. But I've noticed that there's some like weird crunkiness with the search filtering when you start trying to narrow down. That wasn't the same on the RM, Azure RM, which is the next one, which is a PowerShell commandlet. And then the other thing is, once I get into the real quick on the portal blocking, like how to block access to this, it doesn't block it for the CLI or the Azure PowerShell commandlet. You have to have conditional access rules, which cost more money, and so whatever. So you can go to the next one. And so the Azure portal is pretty self-explanatory. You go there, portal.azure.com, you're there. You can see the users in the same way. There's the groups. Not much to it, but it's pretty cool. You can go to the next slide. I'm just going to kind of go through these. I just put them on there real quick. And so for Azure, the AZ CLI, the command, if you install it, just do AZ login. It'll pop open a browser. It'll select the credential session that you wanted to authenticate with. It does the funny stuff with the token, and then it stores it locally, so you could kind of communicate with AZ directly. You could do AZ AD user list, and it'll give you the list of the users. You could do AZ AD group list. It'll give you the list of the groups. You could output to a table form. You could output to a JSON form. If you did target like an engineer, you could do AZ VM list to see which ones they have for VMs, so you can kind of read the stuff there. And there's a link right there if you wanted to get more familiar with the CLI. Okay, and then so Azure RM, very similar workflow that you would do. You would do connect after you install it and you imported it. You would use connect Azure RM account. That's going to prop open the browser and get you the same thing to go. And then so you can do get Azure RM AD user. It's a little bit more to type, but it gives you the same information. So and it's giving you in PowerShell form, so you have PowerShell objects, the whole 9 yards. And so these are just the equivalents. If you look at the link down there and you want to install it, there's the PowerShell Azure overview. It's pretty self-explanatory. The concept's cool, but the way that you use it is going to be the same whether you're using any of these different ones. I do see a question on here that said, do you need admin for the Azure CLI? Well, because you're on your own machine, I don't know whether you do or not. I don't know. I think you can install stuff in like a sandbox if like you're under your user, not necessarily.
I think he was talking about accessing it remotely. I think you can access it remotely. Just some functions will not be available to you.
Yeah, that's true. So you can, as a regular user, a low privilege user, non-admin, you can communicate with Azure Active Directory without having to be an admin. So if you want to go to the next one, I know we're getting
demo time.
Right. So I'm using AZ login here with allow no subscriptions and use device code. This is another way to do it. You just copy the code, the device code into your browser, click the little link. And I'm doing it this way just because I have other subscriptions here and it was easier to do it this way. You see I'm already logged into the Office 365. And so I pop open that link and I copy that code and then I put it there. And it's basically authenticating that session for that user that's currently logged in to Office 365, which just happens to be an Azure instance that we spun up for this. And so at that point, it's validated the session. And now I'm going to list the users in Active Directory. And this is from a low-level user. And you see it defaults to JSON on the output, which is beautiful because now you have all of this information. You have the user principal name, you have the address, the phone number, the display name. There's this phone number I saw. You have the street address, which isn't real. Obviously, I changed it before I did that. I want to put that out there. And then you have all this information for that user. So now let's just see what groups that are out there. So you could do AZ AD group list. It spits back a bunch of different groups that are a part of the group. And obviously, we're going to target a specific group. And in this case, there's the Ultra group. We have Vuln admins, which looks like a interesting one. So I'm going to pull that object ID off of the Vuln admins group. and because I want to see what users are a part of it. So I do AZ AD group group member list, and then I pass in that group ID. And that's going to spit back all of the users that are associated with that group. And you'll see there that user principal name, domain admin. And there'll be other users there. Domain admin is the mail nickname, the display name. And so now I could target directly in that direction. And so you have the whole admin group members from the membership. And so I think that's all we had. Do we have anything else on this? I think that's all we had for the demo.
Right.
But so yeah, it's pretty straightforward to do. And so how do we lock things down? This is where it gets a little bit tricky and confusing, and I got to be upfront and honest. I still don't fully understand. I've had lots of people tweet at me. I've had lots of people come to me and share me links. I've gone through them. I've tried to understand them. It's difficult. The Azure Portal, you could lock down fairly straightforward. As a domain admin, you could log into the Azure Portal, and there's a box that you just check on administration portal, restrict access to AZ, and you could click yes. This does let the admin lock down the ability to pivot over to the portal so that regular users cannot do that. The problem with it is it doesn't block it for the AZ CLI, and it doesn't block it for the Azure RM. And so with that, now what do we do? And so there's this thing in Azure called AZ conditional access, and this gives you the ability to add conditional rules. I'll talk about that on the next slide, but before we get there, one thing that I wanted to note is now in order to use the AD conditional access, you have to upgrade to the Azure AD Premium. So it's basically you get some security features, but you have to pay for them, which is kind of crappy in my eyes. I hate that. I mean, I think I get the additional access, the conditional access rules as a feature, and there's a lot of complexity that went into the development of it. But I think that they should include that in the price and even charge more for the original price, not have somebody have to upgrade in order to get it. I just think that's horrible. So the conditional access rules are a really cool feature. You have the ability to allow or block access to different functionality. You could do it through like a policy. So you know what policies are. I'm not going to get into the policies, but being able to say, yes, you could do this if you're this type of user or if you're in this user group. Traditionally, it was built to lock down on cloud apps, I think. They've morphed it into allowing it for Azure management as well. And it does apply to all the Azure management end portals, except for Azure AD PowerShell, which is weird. This is actually new to me. Now, I thought that the conditional access rules were available to lock down the CLI and the PowerShell, but I was told by somebody that it wasn't. And they sent me a link to back up what they were saying. And so I clicked on the link, I read the article, and then at the bottom of the article, it did say except Azure AD PowerShell, which was a mind-blowing thing for me as well. So now I don't even know what to tell people on how to block the PowerShell. I don't know. But yeah, it's there. So Derek at Black Hills, Derek Rausch, did some research and digging into this in order to kind of lock it down and try to provide a solution without having to upgrade to the Azure AD Premium. And he learned that you could set this flag, the set msol company settings, and then pass in this hyphen users permission to read other users enabled to false. What that does, it doesn't block all of the Azure AD objects, but it does restrict users from being able to read other users. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. And then I demonstrated it. He changed it, and then I tried to read it, and it said insufficient privileges to complete this operation. And so that tended to fix the problem, at least at a cursory glance. It doesn't restrict all the other cool stuff that I talked about earlier, but it does make it a little bit more difficult. Okay. And so that's the end of that segment. You can follow us on Twitter. Beau's obviously at DaftTech. And I'm at You Stay Ready. There's a link to Black Hills. There's a link to Beau's RDP spray tool.
Yep. RDP spray. Yep. So if you want to test out that script, I mean, you just need to make sure you have hostname CTL and X-Free RDP on system, which Kali Linux has. So it's really easy to just run from Kali.
Yeah, and I would suggest if you like the tool and you want to see a lot of features, go there and submit a bunch of feature requests on his GitHub.
Oh, come on.
Just kidding. No, but I mean, if there's a big demand for it.
He's saying that because I'm the worst at like actually pushing pull requests.
No, not that at all. I was thinking that that RDP spray would be a really cool tool to have, and if there's demand for it, I think it'll create itself.
For sure. I actually found some PowerShell libraries that I think will work.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mike, what happened to the Casper proof of concept? Okay, great question. So I did see actually a number of people tweeted at me saying that Alex and Gabby released Gabby's Python tools, which I thought was super cool. I haven't got a chance to check them out yet, and I will release Casper now. I've been so inundated with all kinds of other stuff that I wanted to make sure that I at least clean up some of the code base so that I could pull out some of the stuff that we didn't use that I built for, because we actually used Casper for the research. So I just want to make sure I get some of that stuff out before I make it. Plus I'm OCD, so I don't like, I like organization and
I think we're gonna do a WNF webcast too.
Yeah, I think we're doing that probably soon. So maybe we'll release it on the webinar. Maybe that's a good idea. Did I just commit to that?
Yes, you did.
Just curious, if G Suite two-factor is done right, why are you getting free of Google? Is it more of tracking the? So great question. I don't really want to get into so much of the politics on why I'm purging Google out of my life. Just know this. I have used Google for probably 12 years, I think, and I have known that they were tracking. I've known that they had my data. I gave them all of my data knowing that I trust them. They're a great company. I know a lot of people that work there. I have a lot of friends. I have not a lot of friends. I have a few friends that work there on their security team. And it's not for really any of those reasons. I'm purging Google. I have personal reasons that are probably not really applicable. I'm leaving knowing that they've been doing what they've done. So it's not really any of that stuff. But I'm bringing it up because I know a lot of people have their life wrapped into Google, and breaking away from something like that is really difficult. And so, kind of opening people's eyes to what I've had to go through in order to do that, using Google Authenticator, get away from two-factor and the whole nine yards. So that's kind of some of that reason. And how about breaking away from Apple? Actually, I just moved to Apple for my hardware devices, but I've really diversified in a lot of different ways, which I think is the kind of cool part of starting over, right?
Yeah. Quick shout out.
Is that what you're gonna say? Yeah.
PringleCon.
Yes. So I heard it started.
I think it did. I don't know officially yet. I mean, we've been on a webcast. I mean, does anyone know if it officially started yet?
So I'm just going to say this. On CentralSec Slack, if you haven't joined CentralSec Slack, you should. You can get there. Can you type in there, pull it up? I don't know. slackpass.io/CentralSec. The CentralSec Slack server has a SANS channel on there, #SANS, and we're doing the Holiday Hack Challenge again this year. So we do it pretty much every year. I think Beau and I actually met on Holiday Hack Challenge years ago.
We did.
And so we're going to be probably doing this. I think it just went live. They just said it went live. Actually, Ed said something in the chat. He said he's not going to tweet about it yet because they're still working out some of the kinks, but he did say in the Slack channel that it's live. So.
All right. Well, we might, I don't know, we've talked about maybe doing some live streaming of us playing.
I set it up, man. I'm telling you, I set up.
All right.
I got it going. I got OBS live. We were talking about competing and not competing, but just playing the challenges together, live streaming it.
We had a great time. Thanks for hanging out. I guess we shall see you next time.
Yep. See it.
Previous night at Mike's house, like the Scorpions were in his house rocking out, here I am, da, 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 rock you like a, and now they left.